England, December 1944. The sky over Boxted is knife-cold, thin, and blue. The kind of air that makes engines scream louder, sharper, hungrier. Down on the tarmac, a group of ground crewmen cluster around a P-47 Thunderbolt that looks like it's been reborn. The usual dull olive paint is scorched around the cowl. The exhaust pipes glint silver, widened and rewelded. It smells like methanol and defiance. The man responsible for this heresy stands off to the side, cigarette dangling from his lip. Sergeant Patrick Delaney, the 9th Air Force's most troublesome mechanic, watches his pilot climb into the cockpit. He wipes his hands on an oil-stained rag, muttering, "If she breathes, she flies." Everyone laughs. They've heard the story. Delaney's special engine built out of spare parts, stolen coolant, and a banned fuel mix the brass forbade after 3 aircraft blew up in testing. They call it the Widowmaker. The captain calls it evidence, but Delaney calls it ready. At 10:42 a.m., Lieutenant Joe Reeves throttles up. The airfield shakes. The modified R-2800 Double Wasp growls like it's possessed, coughing blue fire through the cowl flaps. The prop blades blur into silver rings. Mechanics duck instinctively. The smell of burned alcohol fills the wind. The tower radios in. "Red 2, you are cleared for test flight, altitude unrestricted." Delaney smirks. Unrestricted. Good word. Reeves rolls forward, takes the runway, and the jug lifts like it's been punched into the sky. By 12,000 feet, the gauges already read beyond spec. 80 inches of manifold pressure, 3,000 RPM. He keys the mic. Engine stable. Feels like it's angry. At 20,000 feet, contrails streak above him. Twin vapor trails of 2 German Me-262 jets prowling the upper edge of the stratosphere. They're supposed to be untouchable. The jets dive, silver knives slicing downward. Reeves pushes the throttle forward, and Delaney's forbidden mix kicks in. The turbocharger howls. The manifold surges to 90 inches, and the P-47 stops behaving like a prop plane. At 30,000 feet, the airframe begins to shake. Reeves feels the stick go heavy, the oxygen mask pressing hard against his face. The speed indicator is useless. It's pinned. The air compresses under the wings like a fist trying to crush him. At 35,000 feet, he dives. The sound changes. Not the roar of an engine, not the whine of airflow. A snap, like the air tearing in two. The prop tips blur, catching shock ripples that shouldn't exist. The gauges flicker. 720 miles per hour. On the ground, mechanics sprint out of the hangars, pointing at the sky. The Thunderbolt isn't flying anymore, it's slicing, leaving a double spiral of vapor curling behind it. Then, impossibly, it pulls out of the dive. The tower screams through static. "Red 2? Do you copy? What in God's name did you just do?" Reeves' voice crackles through. "Tell Delaney. She's still breathing." Delaney drops his wrench, exhaling the smoke he's been holding for the last 30 seconds. The laughter around him dies into stunned silence. He whispers, "Guess the laws of physics just blinked." For 40 seconds that winter morning, a propeller-driven fighter flew faster than the world believed possible, faster than Germany's finest jet. And the man who made it happen wasn't a scientist, wasn't a general, just a mechanic who decided that rules didn't fly high enough. Officially, there were no miracles in engineering, only mistakes that hadn't failed yet. That was what the Air Technical Service Command preached. The flight manual said it in bold, underlined ink. Do not exceed 70 inches of manifold pressure. Structural failure will occur. But for Patrick Delaney, those words sounded less like science and more like surrender. The U.S. Army Air Forces ran on order, not instinct. Every pilot flew by procedure, every mechanic wrenched by checklist. The culture of the air war was mathematics, torque limits, temperature tolerances, service intervals, approved fuels. It worked for factories, not for battlefields. Delaney came from a world without blueprints. He grew up in a barn outside Chillicothe, Ohio, where you made tractors run with wire and luck. He used to say, "If you can hear an engine breathe, it'll tell you what it needs." His father taught him that in the dust of the Depression, long before he ever saw war. When Delaney enlisted in 1942, he was told he'd make a good wrench monkey. Follow the book and you'll keep birds flying. But Boxted changed him. By 1944, he'd seen too many planes shot down, not by flak, not by fighters, but by fear of what they weren't allowed to do. Pilots would limp home on sputtering engines because the gauges told them they were at max, even when the machine still had something left to give. The Me-262 had rewritten the rules. German jets could climb faster, dive faster, and vanish before a P-47 could even close the distance. Every Allied pilot knew it, and every mechanic hated it. One night in the mess hall, Delaney slammed a wrench down on the table. "You don't fix war with manuals," he growled. "You fix it with nerve." The other crewmen laughed. They called him the priest of forbidden torque, but when their pilots went down, the laughter didn't last. He started staying late after shifts, tinkering in the hangar's back corner. He'd stare at the engine diagrams, the R2800 double wasp, and trace air paths with his finger. "You're choking her," he'd mutter to the machine. "You're telling her to whisper when she can sing." The Air Corps manuals were built for safety margins. Delaney was chasing performance margins. He wanted the Thunderbolt to stop obeying the rules written for accountants in Washington and start obeying the sky. But the enemy wasn't just in the air, it was in the paperwork. Any modification not listed under official maintenance bulletins was grounds for grounding an entire aircraft. Any unapproved chemical mixture could trigger a court-martial. The war machine's greatest fear wasn't destruction, it was deviation. And that was exactly what Delaney lived for. When a new shipment of methanol coolant arrived for the Mustangs, meant for experimental supercharger cooling, he saw opportunity. The paperwork said, "Flammable hazard, do not mix." His grin said otherwise. To him, engines were like horses. You didn't tame them with numbers, you trusted them until they bit back. While the engineers calculated thrust coefficients, Delaney was running experiments in the shadows, feeding the Thunderbolt doses of banned mixtures, tweaking turbo gates, and charting results on scraps of ration packaging. He wrote on one of them in grease pencil, "If the book says no, the sky says maybe." And for every maybe he tested, the Thunderbolt started flying a little higher, a little faster, and a little closer to the impossible. He wasn't breaking the rules for glory. He was doing it because every mile per hour stolen from physics was another pilot who came home alive. That was his real equation. Not thrust, not drag, just survival. Boxted Airfield, 1944. A strip of frozen mud and aluminum miracles. On one side sat rows of pristine P-47 Thunderbolts gleaming under maintenance lights. On the other, a lone hangar cluttered with spare parts, oil drums, and a man everyone had learned not to question after midnight. Patrick Delaney didn't fit the image of a military mechanic. His uniform was always half unbuttoned, his boots perpetually oil-stained, and his language unprintable in front of officers. He wasn't insubordinate, just allergic to orders that didn't make sense. Born in Ohio in 1918, he'd grown up fixing broken tractors with nothing but baling wire and faith. "You can't buy precision when all you've got is dust," he used to say. When engines coughed, he didn't read manuals, he listened. By the time he enlisted, his ear was better than any instrument. When he arrived in England, the brass took one look at him and decided he'd never last a week. Within a month, pilots refused to fly without him touching their planes first. The war had turned him into a paradox. A man who hated rules but kept machines alive because of them. Still, something in him twitched every time he heard the phrase, "factory limit." He'd seen too much death for limits, too many planes ripped apart by flak, too many engines sputtering out during dives while German jets sliced past like predators. Every P-47 that came back smoking burned a hole in him. One night, after a mission that left half a squadron missing, Delaney sat under the wing of a battered Thunderbolt with a cigarette and a flask of coffee that smelled suspiciously like whiskey. He stared at the holes stitched across the fuselage and muttered, "These bastards are dying because our engines are polite." That's when it began. He started spending his nights at the edge of regulation, testing throttle gates, rerouting turbo feeds, sketching airflow on the backs of ration boxes. He scrounged scrap from wrecked Mustangs, cannibalized fuel lines from B-26s, and studied the cooling systems of anything that had survived a dive. His idea wasn't madness. It was simple logic. The R-2800 Double Wasp wasn't underpowered. It was underfed. The engine could handle more boost, if you could keep it from melting. That meant better cooling, a sharper mixture, and courage bordering on suicide. The rest of the mechanics called him the Grease Rebel. He didn't argue. He took it as a compliment. During one inspection, his commanding officer found an unmarked drum behind the hangar. "Delaney, what's this?" "Insurance," he said. "Against what?" "Physics." He was reprimanded twice, threatened once with reassignment, but somehow he stayed. The brass needed results, and results followed him like ghosts. When he wasn't working, he'd sit outside the hangar, staring at the contrails of Me-262s slicing through the high sky. He hated them, not for what they did, but for what they represented. A future his machines weren't allowed to reach. He tapped ash off his cigarette and said to the empty air, "You think you're faster? Wait till my bird starts breathing right." Every man in Boxted had a story about Delaney. The night he outran an MP Jeep in a stolen fuel truck, the time he rebuilt a turbo with parts from a milk separator, or the morning he kicked an officer off the flight line for calling his engine temperamental. But the legend didn't begin until one test pilot, Lieutenant Joe Reeves, decided to trust him. They were both outcasts, one too reckless to be grounded, the other too stubborn to be silenced. And together, they were about to build something that shouldn't exist, a piston engine that could outrun jets. By late 1944, the air war over Europe had changed from a contest of courage to a contest of speed. The Luftwaffe had unleashed its miracle weapon, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, a machine that didn't just fly faster, it redefined what fast meant. To American bomber crews, the Me-262 was terror made of metal. It could slice through formations at 540 miles per hour, climb nearly 4,000 feet per minute, and vanish into the clouds before a gunner could draw a bead. Pilots described it as watching death overtake you sideways. The P-47 Thunderbolt, America's workhorse, suddenly looked like a relic. Massive, heavy, dependable, but slow. At full power, it could barely manage 430 miles per hour. Its turbocharged Pratt & Whitney R2800 was a masterpiece of reliability, not raw speed. Against the Me-262, it was like bringing a hammer to a lightning fight. Every mission began to feel like a trap. Bombers limped across the continent, Thunderbolts circling above them, waiting for the silver streaks to appear. And when they did, the results were brutal. Data didn't lie. By autumn 1944, U.S. bomber losses reached 15% per mission. Average Thunderbolt survival rate in jet engagements 1 in 3. German jets could disengage from combat twice as fast as P-47s could respond. The math was merciless, and pilots knew it. The men on the ground called it the race we can't win. Every time a Thunderbolt throttled forward, the sky seemed to stretch away faster. There was no trick, no tactic, no amount of guts that could close the gap. The Luftwaffe's jets were rewriting the definition of air dominance, and in the middle of it all, Patrick Delaney stood in his hangar, holding a cracked turbo manifold and muttering to himself, "There's no such thing as too fast, only too careful." He knew the numbers weren't unbeatable. They were untested. The Germans had built their speed through risk. The Americans were losing theirs through caution. Every time a pilot came back shaken, talking about how the 262 vanished in a blink, Delaney's jaw tightened. He began collecting the discarded parts the Army wrote off as failed tolerances. Warped compressor blades, overburnt cylinders, damaged intercoolers. To Delaney, they weren't junk. They were data. He noticed something strange. Even at high damage thresholds, the R-2800 still held together. The metallurgy was far stronger than the manuals admitted. The official limits, 70 inches of manifold pressure, 20,700 RPM, were written not for war but for longevity, for factories, for peacetime. Delaney didn't have that luxury. His pilots didn't either. At the canteen one night, Reeves slammed his coffee down. "They're killing us, Pat. Jets come in, take 2 passes, and vanish. We don't even see 'em long enough to shoot." Delaney didn't look up. "You want faster?" Reeves laughed bitterly. "You got a magic button?" Delaney finally met his eyes. "No, but I've got a better way to make her breathe." That was the moment it began. Not in a lab, not in a command order, but in a half-lit hangar where 2 men decided that if the sky belonged to the bold, then the bold would just have to rebuild it. Delaney tore open the R-2800's blueprints. He pointed at the turbo bypass valve, the heart of the engine's airflow system. "This thing's strangling her," he said. "You want to go fast, you gotta let her burn." He didn't say burn hotter or burn longer, just burn freer. For the rest of that winter, the sound of wrenches echoed across Boxted. Delaney's hands turned black with grease and frostbite. Reeves volunteered to fly whatever monster came out of it. They weren't trying to win the war anymore. They were trying to catch the future, one forbidden bolt at a time. The night before the test, Boxted airfield smelled like rain and engine oil. Patrick Delaney stood alone in Hangar 4, sleeves rolled to his elbows, staring down at a 2,000-horsepower monster that shouldn't exist. His creation sat under the flickering lights, a Thunderbolt engine that broke every rule. Reassembled from stolen parts and raw nerve. It wasn't supposed to run, not with that fuel, not with that boost pressure, not with that attitude. The mix sloshing in the drums behind him was his secret sin. Methanol, 150-octane aviation gas, and just enough glycol coolant to keep it from melting. It wasn't regulation fuel, it was chemistry on the edge of combustion. The official manuals called methanol injection a catastrophic hazard. Delaney called it lunch. He leaned over the manifold and whispered, "You're gonna make 'em believe again, girl." Lieutenant Joe Reeves walked in, still wearing his flight jacket and grin that said he knew better than to ask. "They're saying we'll blow half the field to hell," he said. Delaney smirked. "Then we'll only need half next time." The 2 men were opposites. Reeves was smooth, a born flyer with gambler's blood. Delaney was all edges, the kind of man who never blinked around fire. Together, they were about to create the loudest argument the laws of physics had ever heard. At 0300, the engine test began. Delaney hooked the new methanol line directly into the supercharger's auxiliary feed, bypassing the governor entirely. The throttle gate had been hand-filed open an extra half-inch, and the intercooler valve locked wide. When he hit the ignition, the entire hangar shook. The R-2800 didn't growl this time. It roared. Flames shot 6 feet from the exhaust. The air filled with the metallic scream of a machine being forced past its limits. And loving it. Gauges spun. The boost needle hit 85 inches, then 90, then 92. Delaney's jaw tightened. "Come on, hold together," he muttered. The engine didn't stall. It didn't explode. It sang. Every pilot on base ran to see what the hell was happening. The night glowed blue from the exhaust arcs. Someone shouted, "That thing's gonna tear itself apart!" Delaney shouted back, "Not before it outruns the war!" At 91 inches of manifold pressure, the cooling system screamed, and then silence. Not a stall. Just the impossible. Perfect balance. The vibration smoothed out. The whine steadied. The whole machine settled into a deep, terrifying calm. Reeves, standing beside him, whispered, "It sounds like it's waiting." Delaney grinned through the sweat and smoke. She knows where she's going. They ran the test for 37 seconds before shutting it down. When the last echo faded, the hangar floor was littered with bolts, rivets, and 2 scorched clipboards. But the engine had survived. Not just survived, thrived. The post-test data made no sense. Internal pressures had exceeded safe limits by 42%. Airflow through the turbocharger had increased by nearly half. And yet the core temperature had stabilized 10 degrees below predicted failure. It was as if the engine had adapted mid-flight, breathing the methanol like oxygen. Delaney wrote in his logbook, "The air doesn't kill engines. Fear does." The next morning, they mounted the engine on Reeves's P-47D. The brass didn't know. The tower didn't need to know. All that mattered was what the sky would say. Delaney wiped his hands clean, flicked his cigarette into the oil pan, and muttered, "If it flies, it's legal." Reeves climbed in, sealed the canopy, and grinned. "You're insane." Delaney slapped the fuselage. "Takes one to fly one." Minutes later, as the Thunderbolt screamed down the runway, every man on base felt the sound in their bones. It wasn't a plane anymore. It was rebellion, given wings. December 29th, 1944. Dawn over East Anglia. The sky was pale, the air razor-thin, and the frost lay thick on the Thunderbolts lined along the taxiway. In Hangar 4, Patrick Delaney stood with a coffee he didn't drink and hands that wouldn't stop shaking, not from fear, but from the raw electricity of what was about to happen. Lieutenant Joe Reeves climbed into the cockpit of the modified P-47, now nicknamed the Harlot. On the cowling, someone had painted the words "Breathe deep, break rules." The test wasn't official. The tower didn't even log the takeoff. It was just 2 men and a machine daring the sky to keep up. "Throttle full forward," Delaney said into the headset. "Keep her rich till 30. Reeves laughed. "If she blows, I'm haunting you." "Then haunt high," Delaney replied. At 0817, the Jug roared down the frost-bitten runway. The engines screamed sharper, angrier, more alive than anything human ears had heard. By 5,000 feet, the gauges already looked impossible. 85 inches manifold pressure, 3,000 RPM, turbine temp peaking but steady. At 20,000 feet, contrails formed. At 25,000, Reeves spotted them. 2 Me-262s cutting across the upper horizon, silver shadows slicing toward Allied bomber corridors. Jets, the future itself, armed and arrogant. Reeves leveled the nose, flipped the boost valve wide open, and shoved the throttle past the red line. The methanol system kicked in like an adrenaline shot. The engine howled, the prop blur widened, and the Thunderbolt stopped sounding like a prop plane. Air screamed past the canopy in shimmering waves. Control surfaces buzzed with vibrations that could tear metal apart. The altimeter ticked upward like a heartbeat gone mad. "Delaney," Reeves grunted through the mic. "The gauges are pegged. She's still climbing." Delaney's voice cracked through the static. "Then give her sky." At 30,000 feet, Reeves nosed over into a shallow dive, chasing the twin vapor trails. The Me-262 pilots didn't see him coming. They didn't believe anything with a propeller could be there. Speed built. 500 mph, 600 mph. Then the sound barrier began to whisper at the edges of perception. A deep, hollow pressure that made the canopy tremble. Reeves felt the controls stick stiffen, the airframe hum like a tuning fork. At 35,000 feet, the altimeter spun wild. The Thunderbolt hit 720 feet. Then, something impossible happened. The turbulence stopped, the vibration vanished. The air around the plane turned smooth, eerily smooth, like the sky itself had surrendered. For a few eternal seconds, the laws of drag and lift bent out of respect for raw defiance. From the ground, spotters saw a white blur split the clouds, leaving a spiraling double contrail, one from the wings, one from the shockwave itself. Reeves's breathing slowed. "Delaney," he whispered. "It's quiet up here." Static hissed. Then Delaney's voice, low and steady. "That's not quiet, son. That's victory." Reeves eased the throttle back. The dive flattened. The airframe groaned, but it held. Every rivet in the fuselage glowed from friction heat. The prop tips glimmered faintly orange. Below him, the Me-262s were dots retreating into their own vapor trails, outpaced by a machine that shouldn't have existed. The radio crackled again. "Tower, this is Red 2. Test complete. Advise physics, we're running late." When Reeves landed, the base went silent. No one clapped. No one spoke. They just watched the aircraft roll to a stop, smoke curling from the cowling, wings trembling like exhausted lungs. Delaney walked up, hand on the hot metal, and whispered, "You beautiful outlaw." That day, the air war changed. Not because of orders, not because of strategy, but because two men refused to believe that a ceiling was anything more than a suggestion. For 40 seconds, the sky blinked, and when it opened its eyes again, it belonged to them. The next morning, frost still clung to the hangars at Boxted Airfield, when Major Howard, the squadron commander, marched toward Hangar 4 with 2 MPs and a face carved from stone. The thunderous noise from yesterday's unofficial test had reached higher ears than Delaney expected. Inside, Delaney and Reeves were standing by the blackened Thunderbolt, still smoking faintly from the cowling. The smell of methanol hung heavy in the air, mixed with the metallic tang of burned oil. Howard stopped 3 feet from them and said coldly, "You boys just violated 12 federal regulations, 6 standing orders, and possibly the Geneva Convention." Reeves, deadpan. "Only if we lost, sir." The major didn't laugh. He pointed at the P-47's turbocharger. "What in God's name did you do to that engine?" Delaney stepped forward, hands stained black. "Gave it what it always wanted, sir. Freedom." Howard's jaw clenched. "You could have killed him, Delaney. You could have killed everyone within 2 miles if that tank ruptured." Reeves spoke up. "It didn't. And, sir," he pulled a folded notepad from his pocket. "These are the numbers." Howard hesitated. 35,000 feet, 720 miles per hour. The Me-262s couldn't even keep up. The engine never flamed out. Silence. Howard snatched the note, scanned it, and exhaled through his nose like a man trying not to believe his own eyes. "You're telling me this crate went supersonic?" Delaney smirked, close enough to scare the word itself. The major folded the paper, looked at both men, then at the plane. "You understand what this means?" Reeves grinned. "That we win?" Howard shot back. "That you'll never breathe a word of it." He handed the notepad back, then tore it clean down the middle. "This test didn't happen. This engine doesn't exist. And if anyone asks, you were fixing a generator." Reeves blinked. "Sir, with respect—" "No," Howard interrupted. "With reality. The Air Technical Service Command will bury this faster than a downed B-17. If Washington finds out we ran an untested methanol blend at 90 inches of boost, they'll shut the whole damn base down." Delaney's expression hardened. "So we just pretend the sky didn't happen?" Howard stared back. "You want to win the war, Sergeant, or the argument?" The conversation ended there. But that night, long after lights out, Delaney snuck back into Hangar 4. The plane sat quiet, battered, sacred. He traced a hand along the rivets and whispered, "You showed them what's possible, didn't you?" He opened his logbook and scribbled one line under Test Data, Classified. Sky held, machine survived, human belief exceeded. Meanwhile, rumors spread like wildfire. Pilots in the mess hall swore they'd seen a jug outrun jets. ground crews told each other Hangar 4's bird broke the sound barrier. Nobody had proof, but they all wanted to believe it. Within weeks, whispers reached the engineering division at Wright Field. No one had names, just a story about a Thunderbolt that went faster than God intended. And while official reports called it mechanical misconfiguration, one engineer scribbled a note in the margin of his copy. Methanol injection? Investigate viability. Possible future system, MW50 equivalent. That note would later lead to experiments in post-war power boost systems, the very same technology that evolved into jet-assisted fuel mixtures in early Cold War aircraft. Delaney never got credit. Reeves never filed the mission. The test data was lost under unverified field reports. But every pilot who heard the story started flying just a little bit harder, pushing their throttles a little further past the red line. Because somewhere in England, a mechanic and a pilot had proven, even briefly, that the impossible was negotiable. By spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. The Luftwaffe was running on fumes, the Allies were running on momentum, and deep inside a hangar in East Anglia, a mechanic was still running on defiance. Delaney hadn't been grounded officially, just forgotten. Command didn't dare touch him or his plane, not while the results of his insane test still echoed through the pilot community. Every squadron on the base wanted to know what he'd done, and every engineer wanted to steal it. He started writing, 100 pages of scribbles, equations in grease pencil, notes on air compression ratios, modified prop pitch curves, and experimental cooling flow diagrams, all documented in a single notebook bound in duct tape and cigarette burns. He called it the Outlaw's Manual. Inside, he wrote not just what he had done, but why it worked. He'd discovered that under methanol boost, the intercooler didn't just reduce heat. It acted as a secondary compression chamber. The added glycol thickened airflow, stabilizing pressure on the intake side and effectively letting the supercharger breathe beyond its mechanical limit. The result wasn't just raw speed. It was a chemical symphony that broke through the edge of drag itself. Delaney didn't have a lab or a team of scientists. He had instinct, burnt fingers, and an ear tuned to the language of engines. He called it listening to the heartbeat of pressure. When Reeves read through the notes, he said quietly, "You just invented something we'll never be allowed to build." Delaney grinned, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Then maybe I was born in the wrong century. 1 week later, a visiting group of U.S. Army Air Force engineers from Wright Field toured Boxted. They were scouting innovations worth stealing. Delaney handed them his manual without ceremony. The lead engineer flipped through, expression unreadable, then asked, "This your work?" Delaney wiped his hands on his coveralls. "It's hers," he said, pointing at the plane. "I just listened." They took the book, never said thank you. Months later, buried in the appendix of a post-war report titled High-Altitude Power Optimization Techniques, a paragraph appeared. Field experiment at Boxted Airfield suggests possibility of chemically enhanced intercooling using methanol glycol blend. Results indicate up to 38% boost in thrust under short-duration conditions. Further testing recommended. That single line would quietly inspire decades of research, from water methanol injection in Korean war sabers to afterburner fuel cooling in early Cold War interceptors. Delaney never saw that report. He went home in silence. Discharged after VE Day, his service record marked experimental technician, no incidents reported. In the years that followed, his name faded. But his idea didn't. Jet engines borrowed his logic. Pilots quoted his creed. Mechanics whispered his name whenever they pushed something beyond the line. The Outlaw's Manual became a legend, a phantom notebook that supposedly held the secret to breaking drag. No one ever found the original. Some say it burned in a hangar fire in 1947. Others swear it was locked away in a file marked Project Reeves. But the truth is simpler. Delaney never wrote those notes for the world. He wrote them for the next mechanic who'd be told, "You can't." Because the real secret of his engine wasn't the fuel. It was the faith that somewhere between rules and ruin lay a window where machines could fly faster than fear. When the first American jets took off years later, one test pilot said it best, watching his instruments climb past 700 mph. "Feels like the old Thunderbolt's ghost just pushed us." And in that moment, the outlaw's legacy lived on. Not in records, not in medals, but in the unspoken covenant between man, machine, and the courage to disobey gravity. By the time the guns fell silent in May 1945, the name Delaney had already disappeared from every roster. The paperwork buried him under Maintenance Division 56th Fighter Group, and that was that. To the bureaucracy, he was just another grease monkey with a wrench and bad discipline. But on airfields from England to Italy, his legend refused to vanish. Pilots swapped stories about the Thunderbolt that raced the sound. Mechanics carved his initials, PD, into workbenches, toolboxes, even the sides of engine blocks. No one knew exactly what he'd done, but everyone agreed on one thing. Whatever it was, it had scared the sky into silence. When war correspondents asked 8th Air Force veterans years later which aircraft they trusted most, the answer was unanimous: the Jug. Not because it was beautiful, not because it was easy, because it survived everything. They didn't know that part of that endurance came from one man's outlaw engine, a design so unorthodox it was banned by the same system that owed it victory. In 1946, as America transitioned to jet power, a Lockheed engineer reviewing captured data from Germany stumbled upon the Boxted Field Report. Handwritten at the top were 2 words: Delaney Mix. He chuckled, handed it to his colleague, and said, "You think it's real?" The other engineer studied the chart, pressure curves peaking far beyond design tolerance. "Real or not," he said, "it's the kind of madness that changes everything." And it did. When the P-80 Shooting Star entered service, its methanol water injection system bore the same ratio Delaney had scribbled in grease pencil a year earlier: 70-30 fuel-coolant mix. The numbers matched. The principle held. But no one in the lab ever knew it came from a mechanic with no degree and a stubborn streak wider than the English Channel. Delaney never spoke of it again. He returned to Illinois, opened a small engine shop, and fixed farm tractors for people who'd never heard of him. But every once in a while, when a farmer's boy brought in a motor that just wouldn't run, Delaney would lean over, listen to the rhythm of the pistons, and mutter, "You gotta let her breathe." He died in 1963. His obituary was 2 paragraphs long. It mentioned his war service, his medals, and his love of engines. It didn't mention that for 40 seconds over Europe, he'd built the fastest piston aircraft the world had ever seen. Yet his name lived on, in pilot slang, in engineering footnotes, and in the hearts of those who still believed machines could be coaxed, not commanded. In 1978, when aviation historian Arthur Briggs interviewed old P-47 pilots for a documentary, one veteran smiled when asked if the story of the outlaw mechanic was true. "True?" he said. "You ever seen a Jug outrun a jet?" Briggs laughed. "No," the veteran winked. "Then you weren't looking hard enough." The tape crackled, but his next words came through clear. He didn't break the rules. He broke their limits. Delaney's myth outlasted his memory. In flight schools, instructors whispered about banned mixtures that could make an engine sing. In hangars, pilots touched their throttles before takeoff and said, "Here's to the outlaw." And somewhere between physics and faith, between regulation and rebellion, Patrick Delaney became what every great mechanic dreams of: a man who turned defiance into lift. Decades later, in a quiet museum hangar in Dayton, Ohio, a lone P-47 Thunderbolt sat beneath soft yellow lights. Its aluminum skin was polished, its propeller still streaked with age, its placard reading simply, "Republic P-47D Thunderbolt, 8th Air Force, 1944. Visitors walked past, snapping photos, reading captions. None of them knew that buried in the structure of that plane, In its oversized turbocharger and its heavy frame lay the ghost of an idea once called impossible. On a summer morning in 1982, an elderly man wearing oil-stained gloves and a flat cap approached the exhibit. His name tag read John Whitcomb, retired engineer, Lockheed Division. He'd helped design early jet boosters, and he'd come to pay his respects to the old monsters that started it all. He stopped at the Thunderbolt, ran a hand across the cowling, and whispered, "You still look fast." A tour guide nearby mentioned that some unconfirmed reports claimed one P-47 had hit over 700 miles an hour in a dive. Whitcomb smiled faintly. "Unconfirmed," he said softly. "Means classified, once upon a time." He opened his notebook, yellowed, frayed, and half burnt at the edges, and tucked a single page beneath the display placard. On it, written in faded pencil, were 3 words: "Freedom needs fuel." He turned, walked away, and never came back. The note was discovered months later by a curator who framed it beside the aircraft. No one ever traced its origin, but among mechanics it became legend. A final message from the ghost of Boxted. That night, as the hangar lights dimmed and silence filled the air, a draft slipped through the rafters. It stirred the flags above, and for a brief second the Thunderbolt's propeller spun just once, as if the machine itself remembered the sky. Because the truth of that story, the one the manuals never told, is that the war for innovation wasn't fought by generals or planners. It was fought by men in hangars, armed with wrenches, instinct, and defiance. Men who looked at perfection and said, "We can do better." Patrick Delaney's name is still absent from every official archive. His logbook was never recovered. But the spirit of his rebellion, the belief that faith and friction can bend the laws of air, became part of every jet that ever broke through cloud and fear alike. The math of war is cold. The math of courage is not. Because somewhere over Europe, at 30,000 feet, a mechanic's outlaw heart once touched the sound barrier, and for one brief, blazing moment, proved that even the sky had limits worth breaking.